Let's get into the record a little bit here and talk about how the record was made, a little bit about the period of time that we're delving into. The record was released in 1994 to Geffen Records, and since then has been, consistently regarded as one of the best and I think most influential albums of the 90s. Full stop, really. Although Robert Dimery appears to disagree, I guess because they're not from the UK.
How
But
dare he? This
yeah,
I finally feel like we got the American counterpart to all these dimery fueled, British nonsense that I felt like we've had to deal with on the podcast. This is the American version, and I can hear our British listeners groaning already.
hey, bring it on, more fan mail, I guess. And look, I think it's safe to say we've talked a little bit about the music. We'll continue to do so, but it can't go unsaid that I do think one of the biggest reasons for the success of this record was the music videos that were associated with this, specifically Undone, the Sweater Song, and Buddy Holly, which were iconic videos back when MTV was in its heyday. And these were directed by Spike Jones, who was doing a lot of cool stuff back then, a lot of cool music videos. I think he's the one that did the Sabotage video.
Yep.
And I've gotten shit about claiming that a song's worth can be connected to its video, but I do think in this case, the videos were a huge part of what propelled them, into the mainstream, I'd say.
Totally agree. And we've talked before, I feel specifically in reference to 80s artists where the when the music video first came on the scene as a vehicle, and certain artists were able to take advantage of putting themselves out there visually and making it visually interesting, like Madonna, for instance, right? Or Prince, maybe. But the 90s, I think, brought about this like, oh, this is a way to make a short film. And it attracted all this talent and people who later went to Hollywood, like Spike Jones, who made all these great films, right? Like Being John Malkovich and Her, and Sofia Coppola was directing videos at this time. Michel Gondry was doing it, right? And so there were these little artistic short films that really helped push the thing across. So the Buddy Holly video is iconic.
And this the one that was like Happy Days
Yeah,
themed?
It
correct.
was Happy
Great, great,
Days themed.
great video, and it really did kind of, even though it was directed by someone separate, it really made you feel like you understood the band more, which I think is what how he did this song justice with the music video.
Yeah, and for anyone who maybe hasn't seen it, you definitely should watch it. But it's kind of a technological marvel too, because it puts the band in the show Happy Days in a really interesting way that makes it feel like they are a band playing on a sitcom from the 70s, which takes place in the 50s.
Yeah, they even do this cutout right before the solo happens that makes you think it's going to commercial, and it's super cool. I literally, we'll talk about the song later on our focus list, but I've heard the song thousands of times, and I still always picture the video in my head when I'm listening to that song. So that was a big part of this record. But ultimately, we need to discuss Rivers Cuomo a little bit more because he is Weezer's, lead everything, lead frontman, primary. That's a little bit of a redundant statement, lead frontman, but he was the frontman, primary songwriter, creative driver, and the band is kind of like an embodiment of his weirdness, but also, I'll say his creative genius, certainly on this record. And I think to the surprise of probably no one, he had a kind of strange upbringing. He was born on June 13th, 1970 in New York City. Apparently his father, Frank, was a musician who played drums on a Wayne Shorter record, among others. So
Yeah.
doesn't sound like he was some huge heavyweight, but definitely did some session work and was a legit musician. So that lineage,
If you're playing on a
definitely
Wayne
checks
Shorter
out.
record, you definitely know what you're doing.
Yeah.
For sure, for sure. Now, he grew up in this very hippie sort of environment. I mean, his name is Rivers, and it's unclear whether that was because he was born between the East and the Hudson Rivers in Manhattan. There was also, I saw this funny vignette, speaking of The Simpsons, where his father claimed that the reason he has the name Rivers was because he was named after three prominent soccer players who were playing in the World Cup that year: Rivellino, Luigi Riva, and Gianni Rivera, not to be confused with Arriaga 2, and Variaga, or a Simpsons deep cut. But after being born in New York City, they moved to Rochester, New York, where he spent the first 5 years of his life living in a place called the Rochester Zen Center,
Ooh.
which was some sort of Buddhist community. I didn't realize you could live in places like that, but I guess that's happening all over the place. His mom then moved them to a town, and I shit you not, the town is called Yogaville in Connecticut.
Jeez.
And I think his dad had been out of the picture at this point, and his mom had been remarried to a stepdad. He lived in Yogaville until I think high school, at which point the entire community like transplanted itself to Virginia, and they just decided to stay in Connecticut right as he was about to go into high school. So his first kind of taste of public school, I think, was going to high school after living in places like the Rochester Zen Center and Yogaville. And look, I'm definitely not going to judge anyone who seeks out alternative ways of living. Trust me, I daydream all the time about opting out of this fucking hellscape of a society. So I'm not judging, but I think it explains some of his idiosyncratic nature. Pretty odd kid growing up, very shy, awkward, struggled with girls, as we've alluded to, and shows up in many of the songs on this record. He even grew up with one of his legs shorter than the other, and he had surgery when he was an adult. I think it was after this album came out, actually, where in order to correct that discrepancy, I don't know if he had some kind of limp or if he just thought, like, I have money now, I'm going to fix this. But the procedure involved repeatedly breaking his leg and slowly lengthening the leg bone over time.
That's some real Weezer money thing to do, you know. Get a new leg.
But I think that disorder.
Like, I'll get a nose job, maybe. He's like lengthening his leg.
I don't think it's a cosmetic procedure. I'm not sure what his exact situation is, but that sounds like the kind of thing that's more common in the developing world, like a cleft palate or something, and you just need the money to, it's fixable, but, or it's I don't know, some kind of lack of prenatal nutrition or something.
For sure. But I think it's almost a just cherry on top for him of growing up kind of with some angst, kind of growing up as a little bit of an outsider, not really fitting in. His teachers would always say things like, "Come on, let's see that smile, Rivers." And, I think it took him a while to really find himself, and music, of course, was the big way that he did that. And something I really didn't key on, even having listened to this album thousands of times and knowing a little bit about Weezer, I didn't realize that Rivers was actually quite the metalhead at heart growing up. He was really into the band Kiss, so much so that when they actually went to record this record at Electric Lady Studios in New York City, one of the first things he said when he walked into the studio and looked into the bathroom, and he goes, "Wow, Ace Frehley probably took a shit on that toilet." Like,
wow.
Like, that's how into Kiss he was growing up, which he also references Kiss as his favorite band on one of the songs on this record. But his first real foray into being in a band and writing original music was right as he was graduating high school, and he started a hair metal band called Avant Garde, which is a pretty terrible name, I gotta say. It's one of the things, probably sounds good then, but in retrospect, it's like,
it's not. It's pretty bad for a hair metal band, certainly.
So they play a few shows in Connecticut with this configuration, and he, I guess, thought they were promising enough, or he decided this is what he wanted to do with his life. But he convinced them to all move out to LA with the five guys in that band from Connecticut. And
so did he like grow up rich? Like, were his parents wealthy? Poor, middle class? He's pretty ballsy, but I guess you know, if you grow up living in weird places like
It's gotta,
Yogaville, a move to LA with your friends maybe is not
yeah,
so
this sounds at
extreme.
least upper middle class, if
Yeah.
not above that, right?
It's interesting. I really didn't get a sense for what his kind of socioeconomic standing was, but if you kind of play this out, living in these intentional communities, there are choices here that come off, I think, that you could associate with privilege. And I think going to do that. Oh, and he does talk about when he was in LA, he tried to get a diploma from some guitar institute out there, and he was like one of the only kids that actually failed out of that. I think it was some kind of diploma mill, and he does talk about
Guitar Center diploma.
Well,
something like that. But he does talk about like, oh, I felt bad that I was wasting my parents' money and stuff like that. So he probably was somewhat well heeled, but I don't think he was. I don't think he had some cushy fallback if this didn't work. I think he was just kind of willing to, and had the background that he was willing to roll the dice.
yeah.
Yes.
Just to loop back to the hair metal thing, actually, I wanted to say I'm not that surprised by that he's a metalhead because of the way the lead guitar sounds all throughout this record. There's a lot of these like pinch harmonics and squiddly doos, these tropes from 80s hair metal baked in a very nice melodic way that it blends with the music. But I was noticing that a lot this
Yeah,
week, like the squeals.
right. This might be a good time to tell us kind of who's in the band playing what. Because I was like, one of the things I wrote down when I was listening to it, I said, is there bass on this album? And maybe it's my shitty headphones and Dell laptop that's 20 years old.
I think there's
But
a lot of bass
oh, is
actually.
there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I just wasn't hearing it.
There's bass on the record, and we'll get to the players as we kind of roll them out in sequence. Something to note on that topic, though, is one of the first things that I came across it was either an interview with Rick Ocasek, who produced this record, who was obviously the driving force from the band The Cars.
The
It was either
driving force, Alan.
Yeah, that's
driving
good.
force.
That's good. Yeah.
Unintended, but I'll take it. But there was this idea that Rivers had where he wanted all of the instrumentation to essentially sound like one big 10-string guitar. So a lot of the guitar parts are meant to not really overlap. I think the bass is meant to be kind of in lockstep with what you would expect from, power pop. But I do think there are moments where specifically, Say It Ain't So and the closing track Only in Dreams, where I think the bass kind of shines
Yeah.
through a little bit.
I had read that too, and then I was kind of surprised because my mind immediately went to Only in Dreams and places where the bass is kind of out in front a little more. So I was a little surprised, but you're right. That is kind of standard for music like this, where you're just and you get that nice guitar army, rhythm guitar army vibe on a lot of the tracks, and it's cool.
Totally. And on the metal point, I was surprised in that I just never connected these types of music. But as I went back, I did notice it felt so obvious. It was almost like, why didn't I think of that before? Because I agree, a lot of the way he hits the feedback right before going into the chorus on Buddy
Oh yeah,
Holly. Like there's just these little choices that are very metal. And there is a clip, and this is more, we'll edit this part out because I don't have this clip handy, but I can send it around and we can add it afterwards. But there is a clip of Avant-Garde like floating around. There's a clip of this band Avant-Garde floating around, and if you listen to it and don't know that it's Rivers Cuomo, you could easily think it's Rat, Quiet Riot,
Oh,
Warrant.
that's funny.
Like they were going for that sunset glam
Yeah.
rock thing. And Rivers was the shredder of the band. And at the time, he had zero illusions of ever singing, let alone being, the front person of a band. He was actually quoted at the time as saying something to the effect of, well, not at the time, he was quoted talking about that period of time saying, I saw myself as just as likely to play in the NBA than to be the lead singer of a band ever. So that's kind of where he saw his lane.
wow.
Now,
And he wasn't going to play in the NBA with that short left
Yeah,
leg.
that's what I was gonna say.
certainly not. Well, and he's also not a tall guy, as evidenced by the album cover. Like he's, if he's 5'5", I'd be surprised, to be honest. Now, the biggest problem for this band, though, wasn't that they weren't good. It was that they got to LA right as this style of shit rock was thankfully dying its well-deserved death. And they played a few shows and then just realized this wasn't really going to happen with this configuration, this style of music. So they split up. Rivers decides to stay out there and takes a job at Tower Records on Sunset, which I think at the time was like the Tower Records. And that's where he started to really cultivate his taste in music in a way that, you spend 8 hours a day just listening to obscure records is probably going to happen. But it was at Tower that he started learning about bands like Pixies, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr. And because he was a metal guy, he loved how hard and noisy the guitars were. He really liked the, kind of loud, quiet, loud thing that we mocked pretty mercilessly on the Pixies episode a while back.
To be clear, it's a good technique. I just don't buy that the Pixies invented it. That's all.
I agree with that. And if you want to hear more about that, go back to our discussion of Surfer Rosa, where
that's the name of their documentary, right? Loud, quiet, loud.
It is. Hey, it worked as a gimmick, I guess, but yeah, it's not exactly novel. But
I think the premise is they're flipping it on its head and they're going soft when you think they should up the ante. But I definitely heard that dynamic on this Weezer record, so that makes perfect sense. And actually, can I just jump in and say one other thing about this being kind of the sound of the '90s and this noisy? I think of the sound of the '90s, especially grunge, as being this kind of contained noise, like when producers got a hold of really noisy bands. So in the '80s, you had these truly noisy bands like Dinosaur Jr. and Sonic Youth. And by the time you get to Nevermind by Nirvana or this album, it's noisy, but it's like in a weird polished box somehow. It's engineered in a nice, beautiful plexiglass container, right, for you.
It's funny that you mentioned that because it almost tees up the next point I was going to make, which was that for him, he was really trying to reconcile this idea that I love guitar rock, I love hard rock, but despite his metal connection, he also at heart was really into pop music, and not in a way that he really advertised, but he was obsessed with, Madonna and, Van Halen, and he definitely had pop sensibilities. And that's what he didn't like as much about the Dinosaur Jr., those groups, was because he just didn't think it was melodic enough and that there was interesting enough dynamics. And he specifically talks about hearing the song Sliver from Nirvana at Tower Records. And he says that song changed his life. It was basically like his, teen spirit in terms of the paradigm shift for him. And I think he calls out some of what you're saying, Rob, because I wrote down this big block quote where he talks about Sliver, and he says, hey, that's my teen spirit. It changed my life. Hearing him sing about mom and dad, Grandpa Joe, personal family issues in a heartbreaking but innocent, playful way. And here's where I think it gets to your point, Rob, with straightforward chords in a major key. But then the distortion kicks in and he starts screaming. And then it goes back to major key. And I was like, oh shit, that's what I want to do, because it had, to your point, it reined in this hardness, but it actually added melody and major key tonalities in a way that not a lot of bands were doing really at the time.
Absolutely. It had kind of gone out of fashion. And I think another band that this record reminded me of that I bet Rivers would sign on for was the Ramones. In the early days of punk, especially with bands like the Ramones, they were being noisy and they were doing the downstroke, distorted guitar thing, but they were also hearkening back to 50s pop music and keeping it very melodic. So that there's a through line there, I feel.
Definitely, yeah.
Do you guys think this band was as popular with people in their 30s when it came out as it was with people in their 15 to 18-year-old age range? Because there's something angsty about the album, and talking about kind of these parts where it goes from soft to real kind of like ragingly intense.
I'm sure the answer has to be no in a very general sense, but it's also You got to keep in mind that the record buying people stop buying records around age 25, generally
Yeah,
speaking.
yeah.
I think there's a reason that it left such a lasting legacy on me and us. It sounds like because that high school era, the things that he's talking about are very, even though he was probably, I'd have to do the math here, but he was definitely in his 20s, at least 25, if not older, when he was, yeah, I'd probably say 25 ish. But the subject matter is very high school. I mean, it's stuff that if I kept a journal back then, I could easily go back and be like, oh, this is just copped right from some high school kid who
Sure.
can't get girls.
Definitely.
Journal.
Definitely, but I guess I'm just pointing out that I think that's most music, a lot of music made by people at this age, which is most music, is like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So when he was at Tower Records, that's when he started getting connected to some of the people that he would ultimately start Weezer with. And one of these people was this guy, Jason Cropper, who we mentioned earlier, who ended up being fired from Weezer later on. Someone else that he met by way of Tower Records was a drummer named Patrick Wilson, who was really into They Might Be Giants and Van Halen, kind of goofy guy, but, serious drum chops. He ended up being the drummer on this record. He's the only of the original founding members that's still with them. So they've had different guitar players, different bassists and stuff like that. But what was interesting about him meeting Patrick Wilson was that Patrick had this friend named Matt Sharp, who the three of them actually like lived together for a period of time. Matt Sharp will come up in a minute, but so ultimately he plays in a few bands with these guys. Among them was a band called 60 Wrong Sausages. I just had to figure out a way to work that into the mix here. But these bands didn't really work out either, and I think after a few years of trying to do bands, of trying to do live music, Rivers basically just said, I'm kind of done with this for a while. I'm just going to focus on writing songs and then figure it out later, which brings us to our favorite segment of this podcast, a segment called By the Numbers.
Woo.
To pick up on my last point, I want to start with the number 50, which is the number of songs that Rivers committed to writing before playing live again. So this is, again, a window into this guy's mind. Instead of saying, maybe I should write a little bit, reconfigure, retool, launch a few songs with a new group, he thought, I must write 50 songs before I can play live again.
Dude's a workhorse, man. You got to give him that. He's been turning out material.
Undeniable.
Playing live after his first band or after this album? What do you mean after?
Oh, so Avant Garde breaks up. He starts working at Tower Records. He starts meeting some of these guys, and he plays in a few random projects with them. I guess I didn't spend too much time elaborating on that just for time's sake, but it was just a rotating series of bands. Again, like 60 Wrong Sausages. He had a band called
Gotcha. So he wanted a backlog of songs in his pocket before he would go out and play a live show after those bands.
Yeah, and I think that is fair.
Right.
Totally fair. And it speaks to his seriousness, right? He wants to keep moving on to the next thing. I'm sure you're going to talk more about his plans for his education. And he's just like, let's get this done or not. I'm going to do the other thing.
That's exactly right. And so he sets out to write 50 songs. He didn't actually get to 50, but he did get to about 30. And among that initial tranche of songs was Undone, the Sweater Song, which ended up becoming their first hit, as well as a few others from this album that were a part of that initial, kind of configuration that would shape Weezer sound ultimately. The next number is the number 1, which is the number of tracks on this album to actually chart on the Billboard Hot 100. Again, the track was Undone, the Sweater Song. It peaked at 57. And the reason I included this was I found this kind of surprising in going back. Like, I just assumed this was like a hit machine.
Yeah.
And I think it was ultimately, but again, it took other factors like the videos. And I think there was also some aspect where maybe some of these singles weren't being sold as singles, which I think impacts some of these lists. But I found that a little bit surprising. I expected to see at least one, number 1 hit.
Especially this song, which was played. I mean, I feel like the video would play on MTV, and then like 10 minutes later, it would be on MTV, and then you get in the car with your parents, it would be on the radio. Then you get to the store, just be played so much. I
Yeah,
guess that
it's surprising to me as well. I was thinking that Buddy Holly and Undone were both huge hits on the radio. Certainly, it was getting also played on indie rock radio or modern rock radio, whatever you want to call it, the station everyone in high school listened to all the time.
They did track on the US modern rock charts in a decent way, like top 5, top 10. But again, there wasn't that here's this banner of a huge, number one hit song that I thought was surprising. But I don't think they really care because the album itself ended up going triple platinum and selling over 3 million copies. So I think everyone except for the guy that got fired was
yeah, right. Poor bastard.
Was fine. He by the way is like, he took it like totally in stride. Like when he talks about him now, he's like, yeah, I'm not just like the guy who was a little bit on the first record, but I'm a Weezer fan and I don't hold any ill will. So
Oh wow.
he seems like he, took it.
It sounds like though
well.
it's not like he was fired. It sounds like he was fired maybe for a good reason though also. So that might be part of it.
Yeah, it sounded like he was just increasingly unpredictable and was making bad decisions. And when you're trying to launch like a major album, you just don't need that. You don't need to swim against the current.
I'm just saying it's the sign of a mature adult to look back and go, yeah, that made sense given my behavior. I know Dave Mustaine hasn't come to that conclusion yet, but still.
He has not. We're still waiting for his reckoning. Okay, the next number is 50,000, which is the number of dollars it costs to film the video for Undone the Sweater Song, which I also found surprising because even for 1994, this video is literally just them in a blue room with a pack of dogs that show up like midway through the video. Apparently one of them shit on the drummer's bass pedal at some point. I think some of the cost was in they had to capture one continuous take, and I think they were playing around with the filming speeds so that it would look like they were slowed down even when they were singing to the proper tempo of the song. I still don't know how it took 50 grand to make that video though. If you watch it, you could do that now with an iPhone.
Yeah, I could believe that number
Right.
I could believe that number for Buddy Holly, but not for Undone.
Totally. I don't have a number for that. That would have been a good pool. A couple more numbers here. The next one is the number 6, which is the number of self-titled Weezer albums.
Oh my God.
This being the first one, of course. There's also one that they released not too long ago called Van Weezer, which I guess is a Van Halen kind of thing if you want to make it 7. Each of them also, I think, has a color associated with it.
Yeah. It's pretty silly.
It's a thing. And I don't think they set out to do that, but I think the Blue album became so iconic that it was just a thing they wanted to kind of go back to. The last number is 0. I think I already alluded to this, but since I have it on the list and I'm already getting into it, it was the number of original songs on their 12th studio album, also self-titled. The Teal album, this is where they did a cover of Africa, No Scrubs. And again, I think it's the kind of thing that just gives them a reputation of not being a serious band.
I even think that when Tom was attempting to introduce this album last week, he called it the Teal album. So I always felt like Weezer in the days before the internet, I feel like it was a little up for grabs if this album that we're talking about was blue. It's kind of aquamarine. It's not a royal blue, right?
No, it's fucking blue. There's no question.
It's a sky blue.
Relax. I'm
angry now.
We got Sonic blue, Daphne blue. I mean,
okay, yeah, sure.
My point is, it's got some green in it. It's heading towards aquamarine or teal, and I think that was what they were referencing there.
I think the real point is here, when you go back to the same trope, you're going to run out of colors. You're going to run out of shit. Just do it a couple times. You ain't got to keep doing this. Now, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you listeners for helping us turn this strange concept of a podcast into...
Hold on. I'm sorry. Wait, I can't let it pass, Alan. If you're going to make fun of their albums and you're not going to mention the one that just has the actor from Lost, the TV show, on it.
Hurley, right?
Right, yes. That's really a bizarre choice that is not making us want to take latter-day Weezer seriously.
Look,
And also you don't mention the Chia Pet for sale on their Spotify profile, the Weezer Chia Pet, that's where you can grow plants out of Rivers Cuomo's head. Come
They're
on.
not overly self-serious. You can certainly they're not that. So I like that about them actually.
look, they've got a lot of records, and if you think I sat down and broke down each one of these records, you would be mistaken. I instead listened to this one another 1,000 times, and
Yeah, good
that
call.
felt like enough. But yeah, they've made some strange choices over the years. Hurley is a great example. Again, I made the Simpsons reference, and I really do think it's apt because they've come out with so many Simpsons seasons. And I will say, I have found myself watching some of them from time to time with my son, who doesn't really care that there used to be a golden age. And some of it's really not that bad. And I think
Sure.
there's a little bit of that connection here as well.
Yeah, I mean the truth is you need to spend a lot of time with certain kinds of art to make it make sense to you. And whether it's The Simpsons or Seinfeld or the stuff we used to watch in reruns constantly, especially a show like The Simpsons where the joke per minute count is just so high. You need to see them a few times to get all the beats of it. But I think music kind of works the same way. So, yes,
And
so
the
I'm
references.
I mean that as yeah, I'm sympathetic to modern Weezer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, look, I want to just take a quick moment to thank each and every one of you listeners for helping us turn this strange concept of a podcast into what's most certainly the highlight of each week for me. Continuing to tune in each week is the easiest way that you can support the show. But if you like what we're doing, then we'd love it if you told your friends, subscribe to the show, leave a review. These things alone go a long way in helping us grow the show. But if you do want to go the extra mile and get access to a lot of the bonus content that we've been putting out, like our Guilty Pleasures series, our Song Battle series, and to be able to weigh in on episodes like this and actually shape what we cover on the show, then our Patreon page is a great way to get involved either at the free level or $5 a month, cheaper than this can of IPA that I'm holding in my hand right now. Easy way to support what we're doing.
Dude, and to continue the conversation, the comment threads, I know we keep talking about them, but really, week over week over week, they get better and better. More people participating on the free version of Patreon, just talking through, telling us things we missed, telling us where we're wrong, adding context. Super interesting stuff.
Honestly, I'm getting insecure that the jokes on there are better than what I'm bringing to the table. So
Never.
it's getting tough out there. Anyway, so let me kind of walk us through, the rest of this journey, and then we'll get to some of the songs here. So we left off with this idea that Rivers was hell bent on writing this big, tranche of songs and pouring his efforts there. He ends up with all these demo tapes, and he starts just sharing them with his friends, trying to get an idea who's interested in these, give me feedback, or any of them any good. One of whom of his friends that ends up with these demos is the aforementioned former roommate Matt Sharp, who apparently was listening to these demos during what he described as a series of aimless Amtrak rides.
Oh, you're riding Amtrak in California? That's, yeah, I don't envy you there.
Yeah, which makes it no surprise that he then liked these songs so much that he just decided, like, hey, I'm going to move back to LA. I'm going to be your bass player, and I'm going to be your de facto manager of the band as well. When I first heard that, I was like, oh, that's commitment, man. But then when I hear he's just riding fucking Amtraks around for fun,
right,
it actually started to check out. So he gets to LA, and that was when Rivers formally formed Weezer in earnest, along with Pat Wilson on drums and Jason Cropper on guitar. Now, you mentioned, Rob, that he had also been flirting and has repeatedly in his career with going back to school. And for him, it's always seems to be this push and pull of, I want to be a rock star, but I kind of want to just be a regular guy who can pursue these nerdy things without the demands of making records and traveling on the road.
Yeah.
So
like us, basically.
pretty much, except we get to go to college, and I might rather be at times sleeping in a van after a show. Who knows? But nonetheless, it was around this time, 1992, that Rivers had been offered a scholarship to UC Berkeley. and basically told Sharp, who was the bass player and de facto manager, that he's basically given him like a year to get signed before he said, I'm going to take the scholarship offer and get on with my life. It didn't sound like it was like an ultimatum, but knowing Rivers, it might actually have been. So they start giving Weezer a go, and a month later, they end up on a bill as, this was their first show, by the way, as the closing act for a band called Dogstar.
Ooh, of
You guys know this band, right?
Nope.
course.
You don't know Dogstar?
I don't think
Marty?
so. No.
Well,
Tell me about Dogstar.
well, there's only really one thing to know about Dogstar, and it's that for the last 25 plus years, they have featured as their bass player a guy named Keanu Reeves.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's all you need to know.
So I couldn't tell you a lick of their music or their songs.
I imagine he supports the whole band financially, just to have people to play with.
That'd be funny if he demanded his cut from like some shitty.
Yeah,
bar
he's like,
gig.
hey, where's my $50?
Bar tab? What the fuck is this?
Yeah.
I don't know their music either, and I'm sure it's not amazing. It's definitely a vanity project for Keanu Reeves, but one, Keanu seems like a really cool guy, as
He
the
does.
internet and everyone knows. And two, I get the impression that Dogstar is one of the more serious celebrity vanity projects out there.
That's fair. I mean, they've been playing for a long time. Like,
Right.
I don't think they're, Kevin Bacon or whatever he's doing. Maybe he's serious too. I don't know, but there's a lot of vanity projects out there. Although, in the little that I've seen videos and stuff, it's pretty basic. But hey, they've given it a go, and he seems into it, and probably has some nice accommodations on the road.
We've been talking about we got to figure out a way to dive into some more of these celebrity albums because
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of celebrities have cut albums and they're
Yeah.
pretty questionable in many of their choices.
The worst one, not to rabbit hole too much, there's a guy named James Dolan who is the owner of the New York Knicks. You ever heard of this guy?
No,
So just imagine billionaire blowhard, fancies himself as some sort of blues guitar player.
nice.
He's got his band. They're called JD and the Straight Shot. They are so bad, but he apparently forced his way onto the bill of like an Eagles show in Madison Square
Oh,
Garden
no.
because he owns the venue. And it's like, how do you live with yourself?
That's
Oh,
great.
sad.
That's great.
And he can hire all these great musicians, so it sounds, somewhat plausible, but then the singing kicks in and
Yeah.
you realize it's a joke. So they play this show with Dogstar. They're obviously disappointed because they're the closing band, because the place is packed, filled with chicks who are obviously there to see Keanu Reeves. They play, the place empties out, they do their set, but they're still feeling pretty motivated with things, feeling pretty good about the project. A few months later, they made a bit of a more formal demo tape. I think it was called the Kitchen Tape, that included an early version of Say It Ain't So, among other songs. And, then this is kind of the part of the story where it's never super clear how this stuff happens so quickly. But only a few months after this demo was released, it got into the hands of an A&R guy from Geffen who eventually signed them to a deal. And it seems like, there's probably some stuff working behind the scenes, but it seems like it kind of happened just like that. Now, as part of this record deal, apparently in Rivers fashion, he wanted to self-produce the record, but Geffen was like, no, we're giving you a producer, gave them a few options, and they ended up choosing Rick Ocasek, who was, of course, the main guy from the Cars. And he convinces them to come record the album at Electric Lady Studios in New York City. And they ultimately released the record on May 10th, 1994. But again, nobody really knew who they were because they weren't touring. It wasn't like they built up this groundswell of support. They just sort of went from zero to hit record, such that I came across a quote from someone from Urge Overkill, of all bands, who actually asked the question, like, is this a fake band? Is this the Monkees, basically, that somebody
Funny.
put together to be this specific package? Which he had a point, I think, but I mean, Urge Overkill over here, you're not really
Hey man,
Well-
people like Urge Overkill, just so you know.
I'm not
There
saying
are some diehard Urge Overkill fans out there.
I'm not maligning them. I think they've got some cool songs, but it's it's a bit of a step change, I think, in stature of these bands. But
I think what you're seeing, though, I understand why it might sound strange and they kind of felt like they came out of nowhere, but also based on your story, it sounds like they spent the time, instead of playing the shows, they spent the time writing the songs. And there is really good writing on this record.
No doubt.
yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think, Rivers really wrote these songs, but I think where the contributions of the bass player came up earlier, he has some good lines, but he also helped, I think, shape the direction of the band just due to him being the one that wanted this to happen almost as much as Rivers, because he believed
Right.
so much in what Rivers had written. But also the majority of the harmonies that you hear, especially the falsettos, that's him. And so it might
Mm.
not seem like it's a big contribution, but he delivers on those vocals in
That's
a
huge.
really tasty way. And, I think was helping to kind of shape the direction.
I
Uh,
That makes sense to me. I think he adds a lot with those harmonies, certainly. And I think Ocasek on the production desk, I hear many cool little Cars like touches. And as you were just explaining that Rivers wanted to be like a normal guy and had this option of which producer to pick, Rick Ocasek is the least normal dude. First of all, he looks like an alien. He's like 7.5 feet tall. He's a rock star. He's married to a supermodel. Like he's not a tradesman, certainly. But
Right.
anyway, I think he deserves a lot of credit for I think a lot of what happens that's good on this record production wise.
Totally. He really was a key player in all this in a way that producers can sometimes be on the sideline, especially when you have someone that's as headstrong as Rivers Cuomo. But the one thing that a lot of people who have worked with Rivers over the years have said is he'll have a vision for something and he'll be really stubborn about it, but he will change course if the right person tells him that it's not a good idea. So he is willing, he's adamant, but he's flexible in a way that
Yep.
some of these sort of headstrong people, aren't necessarily. So
Yeah, the production definitely almost has like a Steely Dan-esque quality to it. It's almost like the spatialness of it is or the headroom between the different things that are going on are so clear in your headphones when you're listening to it.
I think it's one of the main reasons it does not feel like a first time band. I'm
Yeah.
guessing a little bit, and it feels like someone who's really well trained in the studio at the helm.
Mhm.
totally agree. Totally agree. I think it's a good point to jump into our focus list and get a little bit granular on some of these songs.